The factory your grandfather worked at is gone. Not closed. Relocated. To Mexico, Vietnam, or maybe back to Ohio, but with robots doing what 50 workers used to do. The phone in your pocket costs $200 more than it would have in 2017, but the label doesn't explain why. Your morning coffee comes from beans shipped through routes that didn't exist 5 years ago, processed in facilities built specifically to avoid a 3-letter word that most people ignore: tariff. Trade wars don't feel like wars. There are no explosions, no casualties reported on the evening news, no surrender ceremonies. Just endless announcements of percentages and policy shifts that sound boring enough to skip. But boring doesn't mean powerless. While you weren't paying attention, while headlines cycled from one crisis to the next, the entire architecture of the global economy was quietly dismantled and rebuilt according to new rules that nobody voted for, but everyone will pay for. This isn't about politics. This isn't about whether tariffs are good or bad. This is about recognizing that the world your children will inherit is being rewritten right now, in boardrooms and shipping manifests and factory construction permits, and most people have no idea it's happening. The current trade war didn't begin in 2025. It started in 2018, when President Donald Trump, fulfilling campaign promises, imposed tariffs on Chinese imports. The stated goals were reducing America's trade deficit, protecting domestic manufacturing, and pressuring China to change what the U.S. characterized as unfair trade practices. The initial tariffs targeted washing machines, solar panels, steel, and aluminum. China retaliated. And what followed was a 7-year escalation that fundamentally altered trade relationships between the world's 2 largest economies. The numbers tell the story of that escalation. In January 2018, before the trade war began, the average U.S. tariff on Chinese goods stood at 2.9%. This reflected decades of trade liberalization following China's entry into the World Trade Organization in 2001. By June 2019, after several rounds of tariffs and counter-tariffs, that average had jumped to 24.9%. China's response was equally dramatic. Chinese tariffs on American goods rose from 9.8% to 28.2% during the same period, targeting products designed to inflict maximum political and economic pain, particularly agricultural goods from politically important states. A temporary truce in 2020, the Phase 1 trade agreement, lowered some tariffs but left most in place. The Biden administration, despite campaign rhetoric about Trump's approach, largely maintained the tariffs while adding new restrictions on technology transfers and semiconductor exports. The underlying logic had shifted. What began as Trump's unconventional trade policy had become bipartisan consensus. Decoupling from China, or at least reducing dependence, was now mainstream American economic strategy. Then came 2025, and escalation reached new heights. In February, President Trump imposed 10% tariffs on Chinese imports, framing them as pressure related to fentanyl trafficking. In March, those rose to 20%. On April 2, what became known as Liberation Day, the administration announced sweeping reciprocal tariffs affecting most U.S. trading partners. The stated logic was that U.S. tariffs should match the tariffs other countries imposed on American goods. The reality was far more aggressive than true reciprocity would suggest. By mid-2025, tariffs on Chinese goods had briefly spiked to 145%, with China retaliating at 125%. These rates proved unsustainable even for an administration committed to aggressive trade policy. In October 2025, Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping agreed to a temporary truce that brought tariffs back down to 30%, a pause that was extended but remains tenuous. The important point isn't the exact level at any given moment. It's that the new baseline is fundamentally higher than anything seen in modern trade relations. We're not returning to the low-tariff world of 2017. That world is gone. The immediate question is who pays for this. The answer, despite political rhetoric about China bearing the cost, is primarily American consumers and businesses. Economic research on the 2018 to 2019 tariffs found complete pass-through. When the U.S. imposed a tariff, the tariff-inclusive import price rose 1-for-1 with the tariff change. In simpler terms, if a 10% tariff was imposed, prices rose by 10%. American companies importing goods paid the tariff, then passed that cost to customers. Analysis from the Tax Foundation estimated that Trump tariffs imposed and scheduled as of late 2025 amount to an average tax increase of approximately $1,200 per U.S. household in 2025, rising to $1,600 in 2026. These aren't abstract numbers. They represent real purchasing power lost to higher prices on everything from electronics to clothing to industrial components. The macroeconomic effects extend beyond household budgets. Modeling from the Center for Economic Policy Research projects that U.S. real wages will decline by 1.4% by 2028 and GDP will fall by approximately 1%, with significant variation across states. Manufacturing employment may see a temporary surge as tariffs make domestic production more competitive, but employment in services and agriculture is projected to decline. The overall effect on American workers appears negative. The impact isn't confined to the United States. Countries that trade heavily with America face severe consequences. Canada is projected to experience a 2% decrease in real income. Mexico faces a 2.7% loss. Ireland, heavily exposed to U.S. trade through its role as a European base for American multinationals, could see real income fall by 3%. These nations endure worse impacts than China itself, which faces an estimated 0.5% loss, because they lack China's size and market power to influence global prices through their own tariffs. Interestingly, some countries benefit. Britain and Turkey, facing only minimal 10% tariffs in the U.S. market, actually see improved foreign market access relative to competitors hit with higher rates. Their terms of trade improve as they capture market share from Chinese and other heavily tariffed exporters. This creates winners and losers not based on economic fundamentals but on geopolitical alignment and trade negotiation outcomes. But the most profound impact isn't showing up in GDP statistics or tariff schedules. It's happening in the quiet restructuring of how and where things get made. Supply chains that took decades to optimize for cost and efficiency are being rebuilt to optimize for security, resilience, and proximity. This is reshoring and nearshoring, and it represents the most significant reorganization of global manufacturing since China's integration into the world economy in the early 2000s. The data on this shift is striking. Mexico has now surpassed China as the top U.S. trading partner, a development that would have seemed impossible just years ago. Analysis from transportation and manufacturing executives suggests that 20% or more of freight originating from Asia is expected to shift to the Americas by the end of the decade. Surveys from Bain & Company found that over 80% of large manufacturers plan to shift supply chains closer to market. This isn't just planning, it's happening. Johnson & Johnson announced U.S. manufacturing expansion in 2025. Williams-Sonoma targeted a 50% reduction in China-based production by year-end 2025. Clayson Quality Chocolate, Timberlab, and Craw-Z Art all announced domestic manufacturing investments. A Capgemini survey found that 56% of executives plan to nearshore or combine reshoring and nearshoring strategies, specifically in 2025. The drivers go beyond tariffs, though tariffs accelerated decisions already under consideration. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed how fragile long supply chains can be. When a single factory shutdown in Asia can halt production globally, the risk becomes unacceptable. Geopolitical tensions between the U.S. and China create concerns about sudden supply disruptions for political reasons. Rising wages in China and other Asian manufacturing centers have eroded the cost advantages that drove offshoring in the first place. Meanwhile, government policy actively encourages reshoring. The 2022 CHIPS and Science Act provided billions in subsidies for domestic semiconductor manufacturing. The 2022 Inflation Reduction Act offered tax credits supporting clean energy production and infrastructure in the United States. These aren't small nudges. They're massive industrial policy initiatives designed to reverse 40 years of offshoring. Technology plays a crucial role. Automation, robotics, and artificial intelligence are reducing the labor cost gap between domestic and offshore production. When factories can operate with minimal human workers, the advantage of ultra-cheap labor diminishes. Advanced manufacturing technologies like digital twins allow companies to virtually optimize facility design and supply chain layout before building physical infrastructure, reducing the risk and cost of reshoring. The geographic beneficiaries are clear. Mexico is the primary winner for U.S.-focused reshoring and nearshoring. Shared border, time zones aligned with U.S. business hours, and the USMCA trade agreement eliminating tariffs on qualifying goods make Mexico enormously attractive. UK companies are reportedly planning $650 billion in investment over 3 years relocating production. Vietnam, Malaysia, and Indonesia are capturing manufacturing that's leaving China but not returning to developed markets. The terminology matters. Reshoring brings production back to the home country, typically the United States, for American companies. Nearshoring moves it to nearby countries like Mexico or Canada. Friendshoring, a newer concept, means sourcing from politically aligned nations regardless of geography. All three strategies share a common logic. Geographic and political risk matter more than pure cost optimization. The trade war's impact on third countries reveals fascinating dynamics. Research from the National Bureau of Economic Research found that while U.S.-China bilateral trade collapsed, global trade actually increased by approximately 3%. This seems counterintuitive until you understand the mechanism. Countries not involved in the U.S.-China trade war, the bystanders, expanded their exports to both the U.S. and the rest of the world. They filled gaps left by reduced U.S.-China trade and captured market share from producers in both nations who faced high tariffs. Brazil provides a concrete example. Research documented that Brazilian regions specialized in industries targeted by China's retaliatory tariffs on U.S. goods experienced relative increases in formal employment and wage bills between 2017 and 2021. When China stopped buying American soybeans and instead bought Brazilian soybeans, Brazilian agriculture boomed. Similar patterns emerged across agricultural and industrial sectors where third countries could substitute for Chinese or American suppliers. This trade diversion creates inefficiency. Brazilian soybeans might cost more to ship to China than American soybeans, or might not match quality specifications as precisely, but tariffs make them cheaper after accounting for the tax. The result is a global economy that's less efficient overall. Resources flow not to their most productive use, but to wherever tariffs are lowest. The long-term consequences extend beyond current headlines. Supply chains being built today will determine trade patterns for decades. Once a company invests billions in Mexican manufacturing facilities, it's not moving back to China when tariffs ease. Once logistics networks get reconfigured for Vietnam to U.S. shipping lanes instead of China to U.S. lanes, they don't revert overnight. Once domestic suppliers get developed to replace imported components, those relationships persist. We're witnessing the end of peak globalization. For roughly 30 years, from 1990 to 2020, the world economy moved toward ever greater integration. Tariffs fell, supply chains lengthened. Products contained components from dozens of countries. That era is over. What's replacing it is regionalization. North American production serving North American markets. European production serving European markets. Asian production serving Asian markets with less flow between regions than before. This new architecture is less efficient but potentially more resilient. When supply chains were global, disruptions anywhere affected everyone. When production is regional, disruptions are contained geographically. The trade-off is higher costs. Efficiency requires specialization and scale that regional production often can't match. The political judgment driving current policy is that resilience justifies the cost. Time will tell if that proves correct. For consumers, this means persistently higher prices. Even if tariff rates eventually decline, the restructured supply chains built to avoid tariffs won't reverse. Companies that invested in nearshoring or reshoring need to recoup those investments. The cost structures of regional supply chains differ from global supply chains, typically skewing higher. These costs get passed through in product prices. For workers, the effects are mixed. Manufacturing jobs in the U.S. and other developed nations may increase as production returns. But these aren't the manufacturing jobs of previous generations. Modern factories are heavily automated. They require different skills, often higher-level technical expertise. Meanwhile, service sector jobs may suffer as higher. Manufacturing costs reduce overall economic growth and consumer spending power. For nations, the geopolitical implications are profound. Economic interdependence was supposed to promote peace. The theory held that countries deeply integrated through trade wouldn't risk conflict because the economic costs would be too high. Trade wars suggest that logic is breaking down. When major powers are willing to accept significant economic pain to achieve strategic objectives, the assumption of rational economic behavior preventing conflict becomes questionable. China is pursuing its own strategy in response. The Belt and Road Initiative aims to create trade and infrastructure networks centered on China rather than the West. Chinese companies are investing heavily in manufacturing capacity in Southeast Asia, Africa, and Latin America, effectively building their own nearshoring networks. Digital currency initiatives could potentially allow trade settlement outside the dollar-dominated system. China's response to American trade barriers isn't capitulation. It's creating alternative economic architecture. The World Trade Organization, which was supposed to govern international trade disputes, has become largely irrelevant. The U.S. has blocked appointments to the WTO's appellate body, effectively paralyzing the dispute resolution mechanism. Countries are imposing tariffs that clearly violate WTO rules, and the organization has no enforcement power. The multilateral trading system built after World War II is being replaced by bilateral deals, regional blocs, and unilateral actions. This raises a fundamental question. Is the world economy becoming more fragmented permanently, or is this a temporary phase before a new equilibrium emerges? History suggests both possibilities. The first era of globalization, from roughly 1870 to 1914, ended with World War I and took decades to rebuild. The post-war trading system from 1945 to 2020 lasted longer, but now shows serious cracks. Whether we're witnessing a temporary disruption or a generational shift depends on political choices made in coming years. What's certain is that the choices made today echo far into the future. Every factory built in Mexico instead of China, every supply chain restructured to avoid tariffs, every technology investment in domestic production is a bet on what the world economy looks like in 2035 or 2045. Companies are making those bets now because waiting is no longer an option. The cost of being caught on the wrong side of the next tariff announcement is simply too high. For individuals trying to understand how this affects their lives, the connections might not be obvious. You probably don't think about global supply chains when you buy a phone or a car or clothing, but the price you pay reflects those supply chains. The jobs available in your community depend on where companies choose to locate production. The strength of your national economy hinges on these massive structural shifts happening largely out of public view. Trade wars are rewriting the world economy not through dramatic collapses, but through accumulated incremental changes. Each tariff announcement seems manageable. Each supply chain adjustment seems logical. But add them together over years and the result is transformation. We're not returning to the world of 2017. We're building something different. And whether it's better or worse depends on who you are, where you live, and what you value. If this gave you a new understanding of how trade wars are quietly reshaping everything, hit that subscribe button. The headlines move fast, but the real changes happen slowly and silently. Understanding them means understanding the world your children will inherit. History has the answers, if you know where to look.